The 1960s was a time of counterculture and revolution, pushing and pressing for social reforms such as civil rights, women's rights, and the beginning of the fight for gay rights. In the heat of the Vietnam and Cold War, the population's opinion of war shifted.
And it was all influenced by how badly I think the war was going.
Already grieving for lost soldiers, the country was thrown even further into despair after tragic assassinations took place. Four black students sit down at a lunch counter in Greensboro, North Carolina, a whites-only lunch counter. Their small act of protest sparked the sit-in movement that spread to colleges and throughout the region. Many believe that this led to the beginning of the fight for civil rights, the Civil Rights Movement. Discrimination against African Americans dated far back before the 1960s. Starting with slavery, they began to climb up the ladder to their rightful spot as an equal to the white man. They were never given equal opportunities and were harassed.
And I do have wondered in the past if I had been born in other circumstances and lived in a neighborhood where the families weren't as successful financially, educationally.
Starting after the Greensboro sit-in movement, the cause really began to get ground, and protests began coming larger and involved much more civil resistance. With the progression of television, such protests were easier to follow than in decades prior, giving the cause even more aid. Led by Martin Luther King Jr., events of civil disobedience and nonviolent protest took place across the nation, such as the Montgomery bus boycott, the sit-ins, the Selma to Montgomery March, and the March on Washington, which included the famous I Have a Dream speech by Martin Luther King Jr.
Well, it was incredible. And, my heart just went out to people who were not living the life that I was able to live.
The second wave of feminism that took place in the 1960s took the world by storm. It focused on breaking cultural norms and fighting the inequalities that women faced. Traditional gender roles were that women were to stay home with the children while the men went to work, often portraying the woman to be helpless by herself. The second wave of feminism that took place in the 1960s took the world by storm. It focused on breaking cultural norms and fighting the inequalities that women faced. Traditional gender roles were that women were to stay home with the children while the men went to work, often portraying the woman to be helpless by herself. The movement involved many protests, sometimes in the form of books, like Betty Friedan's The Feminine Mystique, which questioned the role of women in American society.
Then by Betty, who was in your face. Strident would be a good word for me.
Another key feminist was Gloria Steinem.
Gloria Steinem. Much better, obviously because of her appearance. Poor Betty Friedan, whatever. I think it was a softer sell approach by Gloria Steinem.
Yeah.
In addition, Eleanor Roosevelt paved the way for not only women's rights, but for civil rights as well.
She was an extraordinary lady. She was very shy and easily intimidated early on, but she rose above that, and she was a wonderful force for good, and she saw the value in people that were of other color when it was almost unheard of at the time. So yes, she's a heroine.
In the 1960s, we were in the middle of the Cold War, a war caused by military and political tensions between the United States and its NATO allies and the Soviet Union and its Warsaw Pact allies. It was a troubling time for the citizens of the United States as well as the Soviet Union. The population knew that any day could be their last.
So it was sort of nerve-wracking But even then, I thought, I don't know if I should be saying this, it's in God's hands. What's going to happen here? And you can be concerned, and you can be thankful that there's negotiations going on, and hopefully it will turn out that we don't all, go up in a mushroom cloud.
News of events in the Cold War, such as the Bay of Pigs invasion and the Cuban Missile Crisis, spread quickly due to the advancements of television. Communist Russia became a debatable topic with many citizens on either side.
No, I just assume, for the most part, they're like we are. They're living a life, trying to make a living, raise a family, eat 3 meals a day. For the most part, it's just people that rise to the top, unfortunately, have usually territorial instincts, and the common man suffers.
In addition to the Cold War, we were in the heat of the Vietnam War. One of the most arguable topics in the recent history of the United States, the public was split by those who supported the war and those who wanted no parts of the war. Those who supported the war, the hawks, thought that we needed to stop the spread of communism and stop the conflict. But those who did not support the war, the doves, thought that Vietnam's civil war was not of our concern, and it wasn't important enough to send off our sons to fight and die.
And then do your best to do that, but to sort of wind up with North and South Korea.
Nothing to show for it.
Right.
While most of the dubs were peaceful, there was a percentage that protested the war violently and took action to bring attention to their cause. This percentage was mostly made up of young adults and college students who would have been the age range for the draft. Their generation would be the ones who would have fought in Vietnam. For them, it was personal. While all doves mostly shared the same opinions toward the war, the peaceful doves did not approve of the radical way some doves were protesting the war.
Well, I can say this, it won't refer to Kent State, but
Yeah,
I know at Berkeley, they took over, students did, the, I guess, president's office or the chancellor's office. And I thought to myself, somebody should have stopped that initially, scheduled time for proper discourse. We don't take over offices, we don't lock people in or out.
So you feel they should have gone about protesting a completely different way?
Absolutely.
In addition, some doves treated veterans horribly, blaming them for the war, even though they had no choice in the matter. They were disrespected in public and called atrocious names.
Most of my feelings about the Vietnam War now are, of course, how poorly our vets were treated when they came back. The peaceniks, if you want to call them that, I guess, disparaged these men and women that sacrificed because their commander-in-chief said, we need to go and defeat.
They followed suit.
Yeah.
The population was split at the end of the Vietnam War over whether or not we should have taken out the troops or stayed to finish what we had started.
I have to say that if you're going to go in and sacrifice young men and women usually, you best come out having resolved the situation.
Make it worthwhile.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely.
While both sides had their own opinions, the way that the disagreements took place was appalling. The 1960s was a grave decade, with many assassinations taking place. John F. Kennedy, Martin Luther King Jr., Robert F. Kennedy, Malcolm X, and others. The day that JFK, the 35th President of the United States, was shot has been burned into the memory of those old enough to understand what was occurring.
I was living at 613 Warren Street in Des Moines. a neighbor across the street called on the telephone and asked if I had my radio or TV on. And I said, no, I did not. And she said, well, the president's been shot. And then I think the country sort of was almost paralyzed for the next 5 days or so with all the pomp and circumstances of the funeral.
The 1960s was an era of political, social, and military changes. Traditional gender roles were challenged, and radical segregation was left in tatters. The Cold War and the Vietnam War changed the public's opinion towards war and sending off soldiers. To end off the decade, many assassinations occurred, which left the nation paralyzed and afraid to move forward. The United States had drastically changed from the beginning of the decade to the end.
That's the end of the interview. Thank you.
Okay, you're welcome.